Welcome back to our special anniversary broadcast, 70 years since the UN decided on Resolution 181, which basically authorized, created the legal basis for the State of Israel, and also discussed creating a state for the Palestinians, and we'll be discussing that further in the broadcast. But right now we're joined in the studio by Gilad Sher, who served as Chief of Staff to former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Now, Gilad, of course, you're too young to have been there at the time in 1947, but I know you do have an interesting family story to tell us about that momentous day.
I do have one. I was born 6 years later, but during the vote, 70 years ago, my late grandfather, Avraham Sher, wrote down on a piece of paper the voting as the as they moved on
at the United Nations. These were the countries that voted yes.
This is it. This, of course, is a Xerox copy of the original piece of paper that my father holds until today. And regrettably, he was killed less than 4 weeks afterwards as a Haganah member, as a Haganah combatant, who escorted a convoy to besiege Jerusalem on the 26th of December, 1947.
Wow.
So this whole story is very moving.
From the high of hearing, he lived long enough to hear that decision to create the Jewish state, and then died 4 months later fighting for it.
For the state.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do you remember in your family as sort of being passed on as their remembrance of that day, at the shock, what I imagine was shock that that happened? The vote happened.
Well, you know, the creation of Israel was a kind of a miracle for my family. You know, this is a very diversified family from Spain, expelled from Spain on my mother's side in 1492, and arriving to Old City of Jerusalem as one of the 5 first Jewish families settling there in 1620 or so. And then on my father's side, a family from France and from Lodz in Poland, and my grandfather who fought in Kfar Giladi and Tel Chai, and of course on the way to Jerusalem. So altogether, for us, Israel is a kind of a miracle that we aspire to keep as good as it could be. For the generations to come.
Gilad, I want to look at the resolution itself, because most Israelis only celebrate it as creating the State of Israel or giving the legal basis for the creation of Israel. Ignore some of the other interesting aspects of it. It called for a Palestinian state. It called for Jerusalem's internationalization, for example.
Well, not exactly a Palestinian state, but an Arab state and a Jewish state. The Jewish state was granted, according to this resolution, with 55% of British Mandatory Palestine, including 10,000 square kilometers in the Negev. Nobody was living there at that point in time. And the Palestinians were granted, of course, 45%. Throughout the years of the negotiations in the last 2.5 decades, there's one thing that should be noted, and that is that Israel will keep about 78% of British Mandatory Palestine, while the Palestinians went down to 22%. So the rejectionism of the Palestinians was not that successful, not then and not now. Plus, Jerusalem was a corpus separatum, was under UN supervision, UN jurisdiction, and Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Now Jerusalem is something different. It's Israel's capital, you know. So many things changed throughout the years, but still, these were the foundations, the international foundations for the two-state solution that we eventually will have one day if negotiations do resume and succeed.
On that optimistic note that we'll get to a little bit later, if a two-state solution is actually possible 70 years later, all things considered, let's jump back to our Jordana Miller in Jerusalem. And Jordan, if we just do a little spotlight on Israeli government 70 years later, we heard that statement from the Prime Minister sort of congratulating Israel on this day, but Israeli government itself is divided, and there is a lot of criticism from inside Israel, even on the nature of Israeli democracy itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this government has suffered a lot of criticisms about its ability to really uphold democratic values. We see a number of bills being proposed just in the last couple months, most notably the one perhaps to shield the prime minister from the corruption investigations that he is a part of. He's a suspect in 2 cases. And now we're looking at a bill that would essentially not allow the police to tell the public about their conclusions and investigations and their recommendations, whether to charge or not charge public officials. And this seems to be really undermining the democratic process. These are public officials. The public has a right to know. There's a transparency issue there. So there are lots of issues and still imperfections with this government, with the state of Israeli democracy, even 70 years later. For all that it has achieved, certainly there is still more that needs to be done, and challenges also to freedom of the press, for example. I mean, there has been no prime minister like Benjamin Netanyahu that has attacked and vilified the press to this extent, probably in Israel's history.
Thank you,
that is also a part of the democratic process.
Thank you, Jordana Miller. Well, we're joined in the studio now by Avi Pazner, former Israeli ambassador to France and Italy. And Avi, Mr. Ambassador, I want to ask you as a diplomat.
Yeah.
That vote in the UN, Israel getting votes from countries that really haven't even supported practically anything Israel has done since then. Was that Israel's greatest, or the Zionist establishment's greatest diplomatic achievement ever?
Certainly the greatest our Israel ever had at the United Nations. We didn't have a vote like that since then, and since then there is a bias against Israel. But this is a unique vote which is going to go down in history as the starting point of our new independence. It is unique. It is not, there's no precedent for it, and there was no vote like that afterwards. Not ever. I was at the UN many times for the General Assembly, and each time I was there, I saw the struggle of our representative to try to gather some votes without much success. And I was thinking about that night that Israel won the day at the United Nations.
And Gilad, looking now, let's taking it a bit further. Is that resolution, with the variations we discussed, certainly things, the International of Jerusalem is off the table, I think, for both sides, but is that the basis for moving forward in negotiations still, 181?
I believe that the two-state solution, one Arab, one Jewish, is still the best, in the best interests of both parties, by the way. And I believe that you have other United Nations Security Council resolutions that complement this one, which are 242, of course, in 1967 and 338 in 1973. Both of them are the basis for any kind of agreement, arrangement, understandings between Israelis and Palestinians, and in the larger context with the region altogether.
All right, Gilad, Sharon, Avi Pazner, thanks very much for now. We're going to go out for a quick break, but stay with us. When we're back, we'll take you back to East Jerusalem to hear another perspective on that substantial, momentous, historic day, 1947, the division of British Mandatory Palestine. Clearly a lot of after effects until today.